Hello and welcome back to a brand new season of the Pandemic Baseball Book Club. I'm so happy to be here in 2022 with a whole host of new authors, bringing a cavalcade of new baseball books to the table. And it is my distinct pleasure to kick things off this season with a longtime favorite. I'm here on Zoom with Peter Golenbach, who, if you don't know that name by now, you will soon, and you have a deep dive to take ahead of you. He has written more than 60 books, including 10 New York Times bestsellers, among them Dynasty, the New York Yankees,
Yay.
1949 to 1964, The Bronx Zoo with Sparky Lyle, Bums, about the Brooklyn Dodgers, Balls with Greg Nettles, and The Spirit of St. Louis, about the St. Louis Cardinals. That is just from my personal collection. There are a lot more that I don't have. You can only own so many baseball books. These are all great. His new one is called Whispers of the Gods, Tales from Baseball's Golden Age, told by the men who played it, which came out in March, published by Rowman and Littlefield. Unfortunately, the publisher has completely sold out of copies in such a thorough fashion that there was not even an advance copy for me to hold in my hands to show you. So you can look it up on Google and imagine I'm holding a book here.
Right. Hang on. There. That's what it looks like.
There you go.
They sent me 10. They sent me 10 of these. So that's probably why they don't have any more. They sent me these 10.
They printed 12 and you got 10 of them.
That's it.
Well, hey, Peter, welcome to the big show. Glad to have you on board for this conversation.
My pleasure. I am honored to be here with you.
Before we get into your new book, I want to dig into your story just a little bit because I love this story. If I understand correctly, you worked as a licensed attorney for the publishing house Prentice Hall.
I did.
And began your career by pitching them on writing a book yourself. Then this book.
I joined Prentice Hall in June of 1972 and was assigned the job of translating the rules and regulations of the Richard Nixon wage and price controls to put into English for banks and lawyers and so forth. That was my job. And I discovered very quickly that anytime the corporations wanted to raise the prices, they were given permission to do so. But anytime the workers wanted a raise in salary, they were always denied. So I'm reading this and I'm deciding this is not the greatest job in the whole wide world. About 6 weeks into it, I decided that what I would do was go to the publishing company, to the trade book division, and talk them into doing a sequel to The New York Yankees by Frank Graham. When I was a kid, that was the book, The New York Yankees by Frank Graham. Babe Ruth, Lou Gehrig, all these people were talking in that book, and I was just mesmerized. So the Yankees between 1949 and 64, 16 years, 14 pennants, 9 world championships, nobody had ever written about it. So I thought, who should write the sequel to the New York Yankees but me? So in youthful ignorance, I walked down to the head of the trade book company, knocked on his door. He let me in, which is not what happens in publishing companies anymore, and talked him into giving me a contract to write Dynasty.
That's who should write it but me, I think is what's known in the industry as chutzpah.
Yes, I think that's right. Yes.
And your editor was obviously receptive, at least to the point
where
he
was not a Boston Red Sox fan. That was the important thing. He was a crazy Yankee fan too. So he saw, so what I said to him, in these 16 years, there were something like 50 million Yankee fans. If we sold 1% of those Yankee fans a book, we'd have a bestseller on our hands. A stupid argument, but he bought it and he gave me a contract.
Well, if you've been through law school, any argument you make holds just that little extra bit of gravitas.
Without a doubt, absolutely. You know, I had my JD degree in hand. I was, you know.
And given your years spent and expenses incurred in law school, it seems like a bit of a leap to enter the highly lucrative, said in air quotes, field of journalism.
Well, the funny thing is I spent 4 years at Dartmouth, spending most of my time working on the Dartmouth, the newspaper, the daily newspaper. I started sports when I was a freshman. When I was a freshman, I was writing the varsity football games, which is, you know, somebody thought I was pretty good at what I did. And then I became the sports editor my junior year. I was writing sports, Dartmouth sports, for the New York Times and the Boston Globe. And then when I went to law school, my good friend was the sports editor of the Stamford Advocate. I grew up in Stamford, Connecticut. Bobby Kennedy was his name, and I talked him into giving me credentials for the Knicks, the Rangers, the Yankees, the Mets, whoever played. And in exchange, on the weekends, I would do interviews and write articles for the Advocate for nothing.
Seems like a fair deal.
It was tremendous. So I had access to the Knicks when they won in 70. Phil Jackson became a close friend of mine. Knicks won again in 73. I was still in New York. I felt comfortable doing it. So that when I went to the guy at Prentice Hall to talk him into, you know, giving me money to write a book on the Yankees, I really felt that this is something that I could do. The difference was this. After spending 4 months in the New York Yankees cellar, doing research with all their thousands and thousands of newspaper articles, it then occurred to me when I sat down to write this book, you cannot write a book based on newspaper articles. You absolutely must go see the people involved. So fortunately, Mike Burke was the owner of the Yankees at the time. This is just before Steinbrenner came and chopped his neck off. And Burke was a real sweetheart, decent guy. And he wrote a letter to dear Yankee player, please give Peter Golenbach all of your cooperation. And not only that, but the Yankees gave me the telephone numbers and addresses of all the former Yankees. How's that for a start?
That's a dream.
So off I went.
Were you traveling the country? Were you
33,000 miles. I traveled the country, driving, flying. I spent 2.5 years doing interviews, going to some incredibly wonderful places, you know, places obviously I had never been to before, all the way from Oneonta, New York. The first guy I interviewed was Jim Constanti, because it was near the Hall of Fame. I had done some research and Constanti was near that. All the way out to California to catch up with Don Larson and Andy Carey and 2 or 3 other former players.
And not Joe DiMaggio.
He was the only one. I was in his restaurant talking to his older brother, Tom, and Tom made it clear that Joe DiMaggio was not going to come and you know, talk to me. And the reason for that was he didn't want people asking him about Marilyn Monroe. It had nothing to do with baseball, oddly enough. And the other funny thing is, you know, in Whispers of the Gods, among the people I'm interviewing, Whispers of the Gods, is Roger Maris.
Mm-hmm.
For Dynasty, I had gone to Gainesville to interview him, and he was not there. I had sent him telegrams and wrote him letters, no responses whatsoever. So I was sure that in addition to DiMaggio, that I probably wouldn't get an interview with Maris either. So I left it was an Anheuser-Busch place in Gainesville. He had played 2 years for the Cardinals and helped them win 2 pennants, and Gussie Busch gave him a beer distributorship in Gainesville. So I left there and I went down to Atlanta to interview Clete Boyer. And Clete Boyer said, okay, fine, I'll meet you tomorrow at 9 o'clock in the morning at my bar, the Golden Glove. So I went there and I'm sitting there drinking sure it was coffee while all the ex-high school football players were sitting at the bar at 9 o'clock in the morning drinking beer. And I sat there till noon, 3 o'clock, 6 o'clock, 8 o'clock at night, sitting there. I mean, what are you going to do? You're going to sit? He said he's coming. So 9 o'clock at night, he shows up with Roger Maris. It was fairly amazing. So Cleet says to Roger and me, go on over to the table. I'll join you in a few minutes. I got some business to take care of. So I'm sitting with Roger and, hello, how are you? And I'm afraid to say to him, can I interview you? Because if he said no, it would have ruined the evening. I didn't want to do that. But about 2 minutes later, after this very uncomfortable silence, Roger said to me, would you like to go outside and talk? And I said, absolutely. And I had my pocket tape recorder with me, and I sat on the hood of a car while I interviewed him. And I must say, I love the guy. He was honest and open and absolutely fabulous. And pieces of the interview I put in Dynasty. But in Whispers of the Gods, you've got the entire interview from hello to thank you. Well, and I was going to say, he talked so dramatically about the 61 season when he hit all those home runs. And one of the things he said was, in a way, I was sorry I did it because so much came down on his head. He was not comfortable with the media. He was not friendly with the reporters. And he said that by June or July, he was getting 5 or 6 times before every game, Roger, do you think you can break Babe Ruth's record? And he was sick of it. He didn't want it anymore. And the pressure, he's telling me, was so great that towards the end, his hair was falling out. And he had to take a day off because it was killing him. The other story that he told, which is in Whispers of the Gods, was how in the 1966 season, he had slid into home plate and caught his hand on the spikes of an umpire and broke it. The Yankees had him x-rayed, and Ralph Houck, the general manager, did not tell him his hand was broken. So he played several weeks with a broken hand and obviously didn't do very well. But the Yankees needed him as a draw because the team was in the cellar and they needed to, have fans come to see him play. So at the end of the season, he went and he told Houck that he was retiring. And Houck had asked him, he said, Roger, please, could you wait until the spring to make that announcement? And then we'll throw a party for you and we'll do a big deal out of it. And Roger said, yeah, okay, what difference does it make? And then about a week later, Ralph Houck traded him to the St. Louis Cardinals. And Roger was just absolutely furious to be, treated like that.
Yeah, I mean, that is one of the more pound for pound, hard hitting chapters in this book. It's not one of the longest chapters, but it's certainly one of the densest.
Yeah.
And so, which I guess you've made the transition for me into Whispers of the Gods. The format, as you just alluded to, is ball players telling their own stories in their own words, which is an incredibly effective format if treated properly. The granddaddy of this kind of book, as you yourself acknowledge in the foreword, is Lawrence Ritter's Glory of Their Times.
Exactly.
Which you read in college and seems to have planted a bug.
Yep.
What was the transition from appreciating that book to wanting to put this book together?
Jim Bouton and I had been very close friends. When I lived in Englewood, New Jersey, he lived about 3 blocks away. I used to babysit his kids. He and we would race our Fiats on the streets. We played on the Jim Jensen CBS All-Star team together. We were very close. And a couple of years ago, he developed what turned out to be dementia. And last year he died. And I thought, what could I do to sort of keep his memory alive? And the one thing I could do is take the interviews that I did with him and put them in a book of interviews with other ball players. So I took my interview with Ted Williams, where he talked about whether Joe Jackson should be in the Hall of Fame. I had a wonderful interview with Stan Musial, with Ron Santo, Roy Campanella, Monte Irvin, who was a good friend of mine, was a prince of a guy. And I made the first chapter was Jim Bouton talking about how difficult it was for him to make it as a major league ball player, and the surprise when he turned out to be a star. In 62, he won 21 games. In 63, he won 18 games. He had two really marvelous seasons. And he talked too about what happened when the Yankees finally went into the toilet. They had gotten rid of Yogi Berra as a manager and hired Johnny Keane, and how terrible that was. And he was a wonderful storyteller. So all of those stories are in there. And then the other thing we talked about was what happened after he wrote Ball 4. And he took a lot of grief from that. Mickey Mantle said he would never come back to Old Timers Day game if Bouton was there. Hank Aaron said terrible things about Jim. The commissioner, Bowie Kuhn, said terrible things about Jim. And so what he had to say about all of that, we talked about, and that's all in this book too. And
clearly you made a decision to bifurcate that, because Bouton leads off the book and he also closes the book with those.
Yeah, so sort of as an honor, in a way, my honor to Jim. Yeah, exactly.
So the difference between Glory of Their Times and this, one big difference anyway, as far as I can tell, is that Ritter intentionally traveled the country to talk to these aging players before they departed the planet to get their firsthand perspective about what the sport was like in their heydays. And he did it specifically for that book.
Just for that book, yes.
You realized you had a lot of material already in your archive and you mined that. I did
indeed, yes.
Was there a process you went through for deciding how to approach it, and not only which players to utilize, but which portions of those interviews to utilize?
I wanted to make sure that everybody who was in this book was interesting. I wanted to make sure they had something to say that baseball fans would want to read. Certainly, I had several of the players talking about Jackie Robinson. He's certainly a focus of any, historical baseball book you want to write. So I had Kirby Higbe, for one, was talking about Jackie Robinson. Roy Campanella was talking about Jackie Robinson.
Marty Marion.
I'm sorry?
Did Marty Marion discuss?
Oh, Marty. Yeah, Marty. Well, interesting too, because the Cardinals were supposedly to want to go on strike. The story was the Cardinals were going to go on strike if Robinson came to St. Louis. And I thought it interesting. Marty sort of poo-pooed that, said that was not true.
This is obviously one person's reading. It did seem like a lot of revisionist history on Marty's part, the way he approached specifically Jackie Robinson.
It could very well be. But again, it's Marty's story, and he's entitled to it. Absolutely.
And I mean, that was one of my favorite facets of this book, is on one hand, you've got Marty Marion talking about how Enos Slaughter spiking Jackie Robinson was a complete accident. He would never do anything like that.
Right.
It's been overblown, way out of proportion. And sure, the Cardinals hated Jackie Robinson, but the Cardinals hated all the Dodgers, and you can't hold that against him. Exactly. And on the other hand, you've got Kirby Higbe saying, "Oh my God, it was intentional." And you even have Stan Musial saying Jackie Robinson ended up on first base later in that game, ready to take out, the second baseman or shortstop, whoever was covering,
right,
regardless of the play. And Musial saying you have every right to do that for what Enos did to you.
And so he didn't do it. And so Jackie,
and that diffused him.
Yes.
But I mean, so you don't even need your own personal editorial voice in here. You've got all these individual voices saying, yeah, you're saying this, but it doesn't really hold that much water.
Well, that's my hope. My hope was that people with a certain depth of knowledge would figure that out. Yes, as you did.
Were there any other moments or events that kind of held that scene?
Jackie was really the player who created the divisiveness. I mean, I met Jackie when I was 10 years old. My uncle Justin Golenbach was Jackie's attorney. So Justin took me to the fourth game of the 1956 World Series. And after the game, he said, come on, I got to go talk to Jackie for a few minutes about, he was moving to Stamford, Connecticut, Jackie was, and so he was involved in that. So he took me down to the Dodger clubhouse where there was this giant of a man. You know, we shook hands and I had these little tiny hands and he was this huge, you know, never forgot it, never forgot it, never forgot him. So the two people I've sort of lionized and tried to write about as much as anybody, obviously, where Jackie was one and Mickey Mantle was the other. Those were my two heroes.
Yeah. What baseball books did Justin Golenbach go on to write?
No, Justin Golenbach was my uncle.
I know. I figured every attorney in the Golenbach family transitions into baseball writing somehow, right?
No.
All right, it was a shot in the dark. So I wish I could hold up the book and point at it.
There you go. There it is.
Looking around, I'm holding up there.
There it is.
Some of those chapters are obviously longer than others. Some are quite short, some are quite long. It clearly has directly to do with the quantity of quality copy therein. How hard was the decision about what to keep, what to cut?
I never cut anything. I didn't cut anything.
Oh.
I didn't cut anything. Those were the interviews.
Soup to nuts.
Yeah.
Oh.
I didn't cut anything. The only question I had in my mind was how many of them to put in the book. And I counted the number that Larry put in his book, and I put in the same number. I figured if it worked for Larry, it'll work for me.
That's great. Can't go wrong with that.
One of the criticisms of this book is there should have been more. I should have added, 4 or 5 more. But I only have about 250 other interviews. I could probably make another book if I wanted to.
Right. You got a series of volumes of 1 through 9.
Whispers of the Gods too.
Did name recognition have anything to do with deciding on something?
Yeah, certainly. And yet, where's my list? Somewhere I have a list of some of the players, some of the people I have in here. Ellis Clary, for instance. Most people don't know who Ellis Clary was, but I found Ellis to be one of the very most interesting people I ever interviewed. He had played with the St. Louis Browns of 1944 and 1945. The Browns ended up playing the Cardinals in the World Series in 1944. And in 1945, the Browns did not make the World Series because the ownership decided to put Pete Gray, the one-armed center fielder, in center field. And by doing that, they took out their, one of their star hitters who should have been playing and should have been taking the Browns to another pennant. Only because Gray was playing and this guy wasn't, they fell short. I just thought, Ellis Clary is too interesting a guy to leave out of this book. Another one was Gene Conley, who pitched for the Boston Red Sox. And most people don't realize it, but Gene Conley, during the winter, was the backup center for Bill Russell and the Boston Celtics. This was the talented guy that Gene Conley was. And more than anything else, Gene Conley was known one day after losing a game at Yankee Stadium. They were on the team bus heading to Newark Airport, where he jumped out of the bus, took Pumpsy Green with him, the idea being that he was going to fly to Jerusalem, which in the, late 1950s, early 1960s, that's just insanity. And he got to the airport to fly to Jerusalem to find out he needed a visa or a passport.
He had a ticket in hand, though.
He had a ticket. All right, but he needed a passport, so he couldn't go.
So somewhere between jumping off the bus and showing up at the airport with a ticket to Israel, there was an awful lot of alcohol involved, was there not?
A lot of alcohol. There indeed was a lot of alcohol. Oh, yes. Yes, definitely so. So the other fun guy was Tom Sturdivant. I couldn't leave Tom. So I went to visit him in Oklahoma City. It was so funny. He while we were there at his house, he showed me his tornado shelter. It's like, whoa, this thing opened up, at ground level, and you walk down into it, so that if there was a tornado, you left your house and you went underground and you didn't get killed. Mm-hmm. Which I thought was odd until I got to the airport afterwards. And in the distance, there was actually a tornado that I could see. It was really creepy, really creepy. But Sturdivant, also a marvelous, marvelous storyteller. I think one of my favorite stories of all time, he was playing golf with Mickey Mantle at a country club in New Jersey. And at the 9th hole, he made a putt. Mickey missed his. And so they were betting, thousands of dollars of fake money on their games. They didn't really exchange cash, but they had these fake bets so that a lot seemed to be on the line. And Mickey took his putter and swung it at the limb of a tree. And he missed the tree and he put the putter through his shin. I mean, literally through his shin, to the extent that he was bleeding like a stuck pig. And Sturdivant, saying to himself, geez, this is Mickey Mantle, the star of the Yankees. What are we going to do? Said to Mickey, come on, we got to get to the hospital. And Mickey, being Mickey, said, the hell we are. We're going to finish this game. So they played the last 9 holes with his sneaker filled with blood. And after the golf game, they had to figure out what they were going to tell the Yankees and tell Casey Stengel. So Mickey had been given a car, a station wagon, as a gift of some sort. And Mickey came up with this story that the car was rolling downhill and the edge of the door caught him in the leg and nailed his shin. But I mean, the stories about Mickey Mantle, they're legendary, and this was one of them.
Absolutely. I mean, you don't expect mortal golf injuries.
No, you don't.
Before we leave Ellis Clary, who you mentioned, a couple turns back, and in conjunction with Pete Gray, the one-armed center fielder, one thing that really jumped out to me in this book was how open Ellis was about the Browns' treatment of Pete Gray, who he painted as an ornery fella. An
ornery fella. Yeah, but it was worse than that. They hated him. They hated him. There was one pitcher. Oh, tell me his name.
Jakuki?
Yeah.
Is that how you pronounce it?
Jakuki. Jakuki was a star pitcher, but Jakuki was another drunk. He was a guy really often had too much alcohol, and when he had too much alcohol, he did some pretty terrible things. And one of the things he would do is he would try to find a dead fish. Go to a fish store, get a dead fish, and you put the dead fish in Pete Gray's jacket pocket so that it would really smell. I mean, when you interview somebody, the beauty and joy of it all is you have no idea what these people are going to tell you. All you can do is do your research and ask the questions and hope.
Exactly.
And then when they tell you stories like that, it's like, oh my goodness, how incredible. Because these are the stories that don't show up in the newspapers.
Right, exactly. That's
the players aren't telling this to the newspaper reporters. Not only that, but this is, 20, 30 years after they've retired from the game. So, what's it to them? I mean, might as well tell you. And they do.
Absolutely. And he also told you about how Jakuki and others tried to literally beat up Pete Gray, the one-armed guy, on the team train when the manager, Luke Sewell, was not there for a trip.
That's right.
And subsequently tried to beat up Luke Sewell on a different trip. And Sewell had to lock himself in his car.
That's right. And so Jakuki was thrown off the team, and that's why they didn't win the pennant in 45, because they needed him to do that.
Exactly. One thing I really enjoyed about this book, and it's not universal in front of every chapter, but occasionally you will talk about the process of interviewing the player. You discussed with me Roger Maris. You talk about that in the book. I particularly enjoyed how Ron Santo nearly jumped across the table at you at the mention of Billy Martin. How did that go?
He surprised the hell out of me. I thought he was going to choke me to death. It took 2 players to get him off of me.
What was it about Billy Martin that Ron
I don't know. I don't know to this day. I don't know.
That's funny. And you know, as speaking as a journalist, like at that point, I'm thinking, how do I get this back on track? Because it doesn't matter whether or not you want to kill me. What matters is that you want to talk to me.
But that didn't happen in the middle of the interview. That happened when we were having lunch.
And you proceeded to pace after that. You didn't crush your windpipe too badly.
No.
And another one, we talked about, you know, Jackie Robinson showing up repeatedly, you know, often in the same scenario, being spiked by Enos Slaughter. And another thing that shows up in multiple sections is the Mexican League and Jorge Pascual trying to lure players out of the big leagues with exorbitant salaries. And you have a couple players talking about that.
Yeah.
You got Rizzuto talking about it. I think you have Musial talking about it.
Right. Right. No, I mean, Stan Musial, they offered $100,000 to come and play in the Mexican League. And $100,000 in 1946 was like, you know, $2 million. I mean, it's like all the money in the world. But Musial was smart enough to realize what would happen if he went and if the Mexican League didn't survive, which is exactly what happened. Right. And Phil Rizzuto, of course, who would have taken the thing in a heartbeat, had this incredibly wonderful wife, Cora, who basically said, we're not going to Mexico. That's not going to happen. And so, you know, Phil turned it down. And again, it turned out to be a smart thing because the league really only lasted a year and a half. And what Major League Baseball did is they banned all those players at the time for life, saying they never could come back and play Major League Baseball. And there were about a dozen of them. Louis Olmo was one of them. Max Lanier was another one. I interviewed Max Lanier for my book on the St. Louis Cardinals. I might put him in the second Whispers book. But he was blackballed and it turned out they blackballed him for 5 years. It was initially forever. And then after 5 years, they said they can come back. But for most of those people by that time, you know, their careers were over.
Right.
You know, nobody played to be, no 40-year-olds played back in the 1940s. That just didn't happen.
Right. And now, if I read this right, Rizzuto actually was about to take the money independent of his wife. And it's for you. And then Pascual fled the country the next day before Rizzuto could accept. And he squeezed under, you know, by hook or crook or luck, and then ended up with a raise.
Yeah.
Okay, so here's one story I want to talk to you about. Another interview that I know is in here because it was a great interview and not because he's a household name, is Ed Fralick. Is that how you pronounce it?
Oh, Ed Fralick, nobody knows. They don't know him because he was the trainer for Joe McCarthy and the New York Yankees in the 20s. He was a trainer for Joe McCarthy and the Boston Red Sox in the 40s. He was a trainer for the Brooklyn Dodgers in the late 1930s when Babe Ruth was a coach. And he called me up one day. I was living in Englewood, New Jersey, and the phone rang. Hi, it's Ed Fralick. Hi, Ed. Says, I'm thinking about writing a book. Would you consider doing that? And somebody calls and says that they're the trainer for Joe McCarthy and they want to write a book. My answer is, you bet I do. And we talked for about 45 minutes or so. And the funny thing is, we never had a second conversation. Isn't that odd? I don't know what happened, whether he died or what happened to him, but that was the one conversation we had. But it was so insightful and interesting that it certainly was going to be one of the interviews that I put into this book.
You didn't take it upon yourself to drive over to whatever town he was living in and knock on his door till.
I have no idea where he was.
Huh.
I don't know where he was.
Wow.
I don't know where he was. Your telephone rings. We do these interviews on the phone. When they call you.
And you took copious notes. And one of the stories you told me.
I taped it. I tape all these conversations. Every
Perfect.
conversation is on tape. I've got a 10-foot tall pile of tapes in my house.
Hopefully you moved everything into an office and you're not taking up living room space.
Absolutely. I have a wife. Yes. Cleanliness is next to godliness. Yes.
Indeed. Labeling and organizing your tapes is itself a mammoth feat.
It is.
So one of the things Frolick told you was a story about Babe Ruth, and I guess it was back in his Yankees days, in Philadelphia, a bunch of guys going to a whorehouse.
Right.
Everybody except Ruth leaving at about 1:30 a.m.
That's right.
Next morning, driving to the ballpark, and on the way, they pass the house, and here comes Ruth strolling down the front steps, heading to the ballpark himself, having not slept. Frolick said he hit 3 homers that day and missed his 4th by inches. And I'm bringing this up because as a journalist, I had to fact check it.
And you found?
I found only 1 3-homer game for Babe Ruth during his time with Waite Hoyt, who is the guy who told Frolick this story.
Right.
It did come in Philadelphia. It was the first game of a doubleheader, May 21st, 1930. And here's my supporting evidence. Ruth drove in 6 runs with those 3 homers, and the rest of the team drove in 1. So while nobody else could survive that whorehouse experience, Babe Ruth could. The second game of the doubleheader, they lost 4-1. So Yankees hitters not named Babe Ruth batted .210 on the day with 2 RBIs over 18 innings. If that's actually what happened, it just goes even further to painting him as Superman.
And thanks to you, we know that it did happen.
Well, I mean, it's not definitive proof, but it's all I got. Do you have a favorite story in here, a favorite interview in here?
They're all in there. They're all in there. I've got dozens of favorite interviews. Just the opportunity to hear these people tell the story of their lives is just wonderful. I mean, I've been doing this now for 40 years. You talk about being blessed. This is being blessed to be able to do this. Truly, it is.
Absolutely, and people keep paying you to write more books.
They seem to.
And you figured out the methodology. Like now, you're just going through the archives. You're a baseball historian.
Well, I've got another book out right now. This is not going to be the last book I will ever write. I have another book out now called Valentine's Way that I wrote with Bobby Valentine. Bobby and I were both from Stamford, Connecticut. And I was on Facebook talking to a Facebook friend who lived in Italy, Salvatore, and he said to me, one of my closest friends is Bobby Valentine. So I said to him, you mind, could I have Bobby Valentine's telephone number? He goes, sure. So I called Bobby on the telephone. I said, hey, how about we write a book about your life? He goes, okay. And we did. And it came out in November. It should have come out in April instead of November. I don't know why they brought the thing out in November. It's called Valentine's Way. And I found, we talked for about 40 hours. Valentine's one of the most interesting people I have ever interviewed ever. And his book, it deserves to be a bestseller. Somehow it's not gotten the publicity it deserved because it came out in November and there was a baseball strike. I'm hoping once the season starts, Bobby can get on the horn and start talking about it.
We will integrate that into the Pandemic Baseball Book Club, give you a chance to talk about it on this platform as well.
That would be wonderful.
Here's my question about that. Did you devote 3 chapters or more than 3 chapters to Valentine's donning the fake nose and glasses in the Mets dugout?
That would be four chapters.
Perfect.
We devoted 4 chapters to that. And actually, the story behind that is hilarious. It's 2 of his players, including Nolan Ryan, were goading him to do it. That's what's so wonderful about it. This wasn't even really his idea.
Where did he get the fake nose?
It was I don't know. I'm not sure where. Whatever it was sitting in the clubhouse at the time. Glasses and that eye black stuff that they used to make a mustache.
So great.
There's a bobblehead of him. There's a bobblehead of him that I'm trying to get a hold of. The one that I saw, the guy wanted $120 for it. And I'll be damned if I was going to pay $120 for it. But somewhere along the line, I'm going to get me a copy of that.
You got to have the souvenirs from the books you write.
Absolutely.
And I'm guessing Bobby Valentine does not have one himself.
That would be my guess too. Though a couple of weeks ago, I went to Stamford, Connecticut, and we went to the Ferguson Library in Stamford, and we spent a couple hours talking about the book in front of a crowd and a Zoom crowd. And my guess is if you went to the Ferguson Library, you could find the link to our conversation. You would find it to be very interesting.
All right, I'll see if I can find it and embed it in the video here.
Good.
Everyone wants to hear Bobby Valentine talk. He's a big man in Stamford, Connecticut.
He ran for mayor and almost won. They posited that he was a Trump Republican, which he is not. And that was part of how they beat him.
Oh, well.
I know.
I'd like to see ex-ball players in politics. I mean, beyond the couple we already know at the national level.
Yeah,
and I know it's not so good. It's right. They
No.
tend to run very right wing, don't they?
They certainly tend to be that way.
Well, that might be your next book. Peter, it has been such a pleasure talking to you. I appreciate you taking the time.
Loved it, Jason.
Hopefully we'll see you back on this platform again soon.
Anytime.